February, which is today.
However, other diaries in the office would highlight the Karori businessman's name. Meanwhile, Thomas Sr., still conscious, had attempted a call for help.
He's moved in his chair, dragging his feet along the floor through that blood to reach for the telephone. It appears that Mr. Thomas Sr. has only got as far as dialing an outside line. There is blood on those outside line digits. His sinuses are full of blood, has caused him to cough and splutter. Now that has obviously, or probably would have caused noise, gurgling, coughing sounds, which has alerted the offender that in actual fact the first shot has not killed his victim. The offender has then re-entered the boardroom and fired the fourth and fatal shot into the back of the head of Mr. Thomas Sr., killing him instantly.
The last person to hear from their father and brother was Martin Thomas. He told the court that he was to have met his brother, Gene, at a church meeting that night, but at 5:40 p.m, Gene called to say he was running late.
He apologised, said that he would be running late because of commitments at the office.
His telephoning you to advise that he would be late for that meeting, how do you view that?
I was surprised, and I presumed that something very important must have kept him from keeping his word.
The matriarch of the family and Thomas Sr.'s wife of 45 years, Margaret, waited anxiously for her husband to come home.
I began to wonder where he was, and so I made some phone calls. I started to call. I thought maybe he often did visit the children.
Did you know very much about your husband's business?
The business itself, no. The arrangement was I looked after the family and he looked after the business.
Yes.
Eugene Thomas and John Barlow had been acquaintances. They shared a drink perhaps once or twice a year and were both members of Wellington's Wellesley Club. Later, the court was to learn that Barlow had invested an $85,000 loan with the Thomas's insurance company Invincible Life in the 80s and then borrowed $70,000 against his super fund. The administration manager of Thomas & Thomas, under cross-examination, described the deal for Barlow.
The cost to Mr. Barlow was quite minimal, wasn't it?
Yes, it wasn't overall very much.
Just the taxation payable by Invincible?
Yes, a little bit more than that.
Yes, about 2% per annum.
Yes.
So what Mr. Thomas had done for Mr. Barlow was offer him a very favourable deal, producing no profit whatsoever for Invincible.
No.
No, you agree with me?
No, that's right, yes.
It was a favourable,
Sorry,
it was
yes.
a very favourable deal, wasn't it?
It was a deal done on a friendly basis, yes.
Yes, thank you.
The prosecution does not need to establish a motive in a murder trial, but the lack of it was clearly going to play a big part in the defence case. This was the defence team flexing its muscle. The court was told that the company was the only financial institution in the country to offer reverse annuity mortgages, a type of loan where the finance company takes over a freehold property as a way of advancing cash. Diane Thomas is now general manager of the family company. At the time of the murders, she was property manager.
Would it be fair to say that a lot of the lending done by Invincible was done to borrowers of last resort?
No, I don't think that's true. I think there may have been some people who came into that category, but certainly not all of them.
Another person named as a possible suspect was a man called Evans, is that right?
Yes.
He'd threatened to do violence to your father, hadn't he?
I believe so.
And he threatened to get your father in the most serious way, didn't he?
Well, that's what I've heard, yes.
It was early days yet. It is not always easy for lawyers to tell what is or isn't impacting on a relatively new jury, but a defence team knows there is one given.
It is a fact, I believe, in every criminal trial that when an accused person stands in the dock, the jury sees them as a guilty person. So you have to unhook that commitment, or whatever you like to call it, that the jury have.
Next, the jury in Wellington's No. 1 High Court would hear the details of the actions and conversations of John Robert Barlow in the days following the murders. The court was to hear from John Barlow's business partner. On the morning after the murders, Barlow arrived at their company to be asked by his partner whether he knew the murdered men. Barlow told him he'd had a drink with them the week before.
What did you say then?
I just said I hoped that they'd washed the glasses after he'd had the drink. Otherwise he might become a prime suspect.
In an unusual twist to their case, the prosecution was to introduce a secret witness, a former close friend of Barlow's who said he'd had a phone call from the accused later that day, and in passing he mentioned the murders. At this stage, the police hadn't even questioned John Barlow.
Mr. Barlow said to me, "I'm going to be the prime suspect." And I said, I was astounded. I said, "What? You're pulling my leg. You've got to be joking." And he said, No, I'm going to be a suspect." So I asked him why he was going to be a suspect. And he told me that he had visited the offices of both Mr. Thomas's on the day of the murder, and that he had found the bodies.
Did he say any more about what had taken place?
I believe I was pretty stunned by all this news, and I think I asked him, "Well, have you called the police?" And he said, "No, I haven't, and I just saw the bodies and I scarpered."
At 3 o'clock that same day, this detective sergeant was to interview Barlow and take his first statement. The court was told that Barlow stated that he'd gone to see Thomas and Thomas to put a business deal to them. He had arrived at their offices at 5:40 p.m.
He said that they, his father and him, were going to be a little bit longer, and said I could wait or go if I can't wait. I waited for about another 10 minutes and then left. And as I was crossing the Kelvin Viaduct, I decided to go back to Gene's office. When I got to the 3rd floor, I got out of the lift, walked over to the office door, opened it, took half a step in. As I did so, Gene Sr. called out, "Is that you, John?" with a note of urgency in his voice. By urgency, I mean it was not his usual relaxed voice. I replied, "Yes." Gene said, "Sorry, old boy, won't be able to see you today. I'll give you a call in the morning. Sorry about that, old chap."
The next day, Barlow came back to this detective with a second version of what happened when he returned to their offices. This statement was read as evidence.
As I put my head around the door, I could then see more clearly that there seemed to be blood over Gene Jr. and on the floor, and he was lying perfectly still on his back, looking up at the roof. My assumption was that he was dead. You still continued into the office to the conference room where you found Gene Sr. also dead. Why did you go through and not leave at that stage? He replied, "I think that in the particular state that I was in, that the human instinct of curiosity was sufficient to see me walk slowly through the office towards the boardroom. From the time I first saw Gene Jr.'s body, I felt quite peculiar. I could feel my heart racing and almost felt slightly dizzy, and without noticing it immediately, my mouth became very dry. The best way to describe my visit that time, might almost be to say, in hindsight, that it could be something like being in a trance or a dream. The reason I did not tell the police immediately, I can only put down to an extreme form of shock and not wanting really to be involved with having seen the dead bodies.
But the court was to learn John Barlow had a third version of what he'd discovered in that boardroom, as he was to later confide in his close friend, the prosecution's secret witness.
And his voice dropped quite quiet. And then he said to me that there was another scenario to the murders. He told me that Mr. Thomas Sr. had had some threats made against him and had asked Mr. Barlow to lend him a gun.